Hello and welcome to Podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. When you're ready to launch your next app, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so check out Linode. With private networking, shared block storage, node balancers, and a 200 gigabit network, all controlled by a brand new API, you've got everything you need to scale. Go to podcastinit.com/Linode to get a $20 credit and launch a new server in under a minute. To get worry-free releases, download GoCD, the open-source continuous delivery server built by ThoughtWorks. You can use their pipeline modeling and value stream map to build, control, and monitor every step from commit to deployment in one place. And with their new Kubernetes integration, it's even easier to deploy and scale your build agents. Go to podcastinit.com/GoCD to learn more about their professional support services and enterprise add-ons. And visit the site at podcastinit.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the newsletter, and read the show notes. Your host as usual is Tobias Macy, and today I'm interviewing Austin Macdonald and Bihan Zhang about Pulp, a platform for hosting and managing software package repositories. So, Austin, could you start by introducing yourself?
Sure. I'm a software engineer at Red Hat. I've been on the Pulp project for almost 4 years. In my spare time, I play the horn, the French horn, although that's not technically correct.
Okay. It's not technically correct that it's the French horn or that you play it?
Well, I guess you could say either one, but it's technically not French.
Okay. And Bihan, how about yourself?
I'm Bihan Zhang. I'm a software engineer also with Red Hat. I've been on the Pulp project for about 2 years now. I've been knitting a Legend of Zelda Link costume in my spare time for DragonCon. That's pretty fun. I'm about 1/5 of the way through. So, most of it to go, but we'll get there.
Sounds like quite the project. And Austin, going back to you, do you remember how you first got introduced to Python?
Yeah, I used to have, well, I still do. I have lots of terrible ideas constantly, and before I knew Python, I would pitch these ideas to my friend who knew Python, and he finally got tired of it and told me that I should learn it. And then when I was in school, I found myself with an unexpected break and got bored, and so I just went head first.
And Bihan, do you remember how you first got introduced to Python?
Yeah, I first heard about it in XKCD. This was about 7-8 years ago. I was in high school, and I haven't really gotten into programming yet. I mean, I did do a little bit of HTML, JavaScript stuff on the side, but I was a bit of a nerd already. Found out about XKCD, read all of it in one night. And Randall Munroe, the creator of it, loves Python. Any chance he can get, he just mentions it, puts down Perl, Perl sucks, Python's awesome. So that's how I got exposed to it initially. And I didn't really use it until college when I finally decided to read up on it, decided it was awesome, and used it for my scripting needs ever since.
And so we're here to talk primarily about the Pulp project. So can you describe a bit about what the project is and what the motivations were for starting it in the first place?
Sure. So when we refer to Pulp, we're referring to the whole project. There's multiple components. It's a plugin-based open source content manager, and Pulp Core does most of the grunt work, and then plugins built on top of it allow you to manage any kind of content.
So Pulp initially started as a Red Hat project for basically managing RPMs. And initially we only had one stakeholder, and that was Red Hat. It was only in the past 4 or 5 years that we started leaving that behind us and trying to grow a community around it. So a lot of this effort was just going to more open communication. So instead of making decisions in a Red Hat employee only meeting, we started using the mailing list. It was slower and it was a little bit of a culture shock, but it's been really successful. We've recently gotten our first community contributed plugin. Someone, Misa from SAS actually, wrote a Debian plugin, and it works. It's really great. He just wrote the whole plugin, and it's one of our most requested content types. In the future, we have a community-only run boost at FrostCon in Germany. So we went from this small employee-only project to a community, and that's kind of the growth of Pulp.
And there are a few other content systems or artifact repositories that are available in the marketplace. Some of them are open source, a number of them are closed source. But what are some of the use cases or benefits of hosting your own artifact repository as opposed to just relying on publicly available repositories for the various types of artifacts that you might need to use for building a system?
A lot of times it's kind of by necessity. Many companies have like a VPN and like really wants to control what goes over their firewall. It was actually at PyCon I was talking to this government contractor, and their company, it blocks off all of PyPI. So the way this guy would download software is he would go into PyPI, get the wheel or source, install it, see if there's any dependencies. If there is, just go back and download it. So if he hosts his own, repository manager on site, then he can just go pip install from that repository manager. Austin, do you want to talk about reproducibility?
Sure. This is one of my favorite topics. So before I came to Red Hat, I started at the Center for Open Science, and I learned quite a lot there. But one of the things that we talked about all the time was how to improve reproducibility of science. And one of the things that kept coming up was that you need to make sure that your software is absolutely the same in the new environment that you're trying to reproduce. So that means the software that you're using, but it also means the dependencies. And that can be pretty challenging to wrangle all on your own. And so we're building Pulp 3 to consider the reproducibility use case. And actually, we're going to be presenting at SciPy next month to talk about that.
Yeah, and the talk at SciPy isn't just going to be on using Pulp. It's going to be on using a lot of different tools like Ansible or Python, requirements.txt or pipfile.lock.
And referring to Pulp 3, I know that currently it's in the beta process and you've been working on building that, and it seems that there's a fairly significant architectural shift between versions 2 and versions 3. So could you talk a bit about what's changing and what your goals are with the update to Pulp 3?
Sure. So the architecture is going to be mostly similar in form. We're going to have a web server, we're going to have a database, etc. One of the bigger changes is that we're switching from MongoDB to Postgres, but we really don't anticipate those kinds of changes having much effect on the users other than being a little more stable. On the other side of things, the REST API will be changing and we're introducing a new CLI. These things will affect the user experience, but not be too impactful on the workflows that they do with Pulp. And luckily, most of the data should be one-to-one, so it'll be easy to bring forward. And we plan to have a migration with no downtime. That's the goal anyway, from Pulp 2 to Pulp 3.
And another thing to note is that we're going to semantically version our plugin API. So in Pulp 2, our plugins it's not semantically versioned. It could change anytime. But in Pulp 3, we do separate out the Pulp core aspect and the plugin API aspect. So Pulp core can continue development where all the plugins are still guaranteed to work with a certain plugin API.
And can you talk a bit more about the overall architecture of the system in terms of how the plugins interface with Pulp Core and what types of data are stored in the database versus a file system, or if there are integrations with other types of storage mechanisms for the artifacts that you're publishing?
Sure. So Pulp Core will handle all of the stuff that's generic between plugins. So Pulp Core will store information about your repositories, and it also provides classes that can be subclassed by plugins. And that's pretty much what we mean by the plugin API. We've also got a couple tools, but for the most part, we're talking about an inheritance model. And so the plugins might override a class for their content unit. So for PyPI, we've got a Python, I think we call it Python package content.
Yep.
And so on that model, you just add all of the fields that are unique to PyPI. And there's some other classes that you'll make too. One that tells Pulp how to interact with PyPI. One that tells it how to generate a publication so that other people can use your software.
So at a high level, for somebody who's first getting started with using Pulp 3, what does the workflow look like for getting set up with the system and being able to publish and consume packages, and how that data is propagated throughout the system?
Sure. So let's take a Python package, for example. So Pulp has this concept called repositories, which is a collection of software content over time. So every time you add and or take away content from a repository, it creates a new version of the repository. So if you're ever unhappy with your changes, you can always go back to an older version. So first you can create one of these empty repositories, and then you can create we call it a remote, but it's basically like a Pulp, it's the configuration of something like up in the cloud, right? So Austin, you want to say some words?
Sure. So a remote is really a configuration for how to interact with an external repository.
That's a really good way of putting it. All right, so you can configure a remote. So in this case, it could be PyPI or test.pypi. You would sync content from the remote repository to your local repository. And once the stuff is synced, version 1 of the repository is created with that initial list of content. And Tobias, I think you asked about storage. So all the metadata is stored in databases, and the file itself is stored in a Postgres file field, I believe.
So it sounds like it's relying on the Django Storages project for being able to allocate where the file is actually placed, whether it's on disk or S3 or some other type of object store.
That's right. That was one of the big reasons that we wanted to move to Django in the first place.
And so is the version 2 of the application a different web framework, and then in version 3 you're moving to use Django, and I believe you're also switching to Python 3 in the process?
So version 2, we actually write the files on disk and create some links to avoid duplicates, and we serve all this local files on disk with Apache. It's not the fastest way of doing things, which is a big reason why we did the rewrite in the first place. But it does allow us to have zero downtime on migration because all the static files will still be there.
And can you do a bit of comparison to how Pulp fares against some of the other artifact repositories, most notably things like Artifactory or some of the more single-purpose repositories like some of the various apt repositories or devpy for Python packages, things like that?
Yeah, definitely. So comparison to Artifactory, we're open source. We support less content types because we're a development shop of 10 people plus a community of less than 20 people. And Artifactory is this big multi-million-dollar company that has a lot of employees. So we definitely have less content types. But of the content types we do support, we know them very, very well. So Austin's actually a contributor to Warehouse, which is really cool. So as far as Python support goes, we got the Python metadata stuff down. As far as other things go, we know our RPM. We know a lot of people who know RPM. Docker-wise, we have people who work on the open source container initiative, helping us get the Docker plugin done. And we know our stuff. We have less stuff, but of the stuff we do support, we support it very, very well. Oh, Austin, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah. The big addition with Pulp 3 is that we're designing it around writing plugins. And so one of the big goals is to make plugin writing as easy as possible. And I think we've come pretty close to that. And we're getting our docs in line. And I think it's actually quite simple to write a new plugin to support a new content type. And so we're just entering the beta recently. So as we go forward, we expect to see a lot of new plugins coming in from the community.
And there's also the added benefit of not having to run the JVM to get it up and running.
Yeah, that too. But it's also great because people who have their custom content, which Artifactory is never going to help you support that, but they can spin a Pulp and make some changes to an existing plugin or just spin up their own because it's really, really easy and just support that themselves. And you asked about the devpy. So Pulp is great because it supports a lot of different types of content, right? And it manages all of it with pretty much one API. So you can manage your Python content along with your Docker images, along with your Ansible roles, all with one set of API commands. But if you were to spin up and host devpy yourself and host your own Ansible Galaxy and host your own Fedora repository, that takes a lot of effort and a lot of different for a sysadmin to be able to support all those, they need really deep understanding of all of them. Whereas with Pulp, you can just learn one API and be able to support all of those.
Another thing to add to that is that we really have focused a lot on our API, our REST API. Well, it's REST-ish, but we've focused on our HTTP API, and that's given us a lot of benefits because now we're working on the CLI, we're working on bindings. There's other projects. There's a community contributed module for Ansible that allows you to use Ansible to manage Pulp. And all of these interfaces just rely on the REST API. So it's a pretty powerful system, and it can be controlled in pretty much any way that you want.
And on the client side, do you have compatibility layers for things like pip or the Docker CLI or RPM or apt for being able to natively interface with Pulp as a source of those various content types? Or is it necessary for the user to build some sort of compatibility layer to download the packages and then independently install them from disk?
So this is what the Pulp publications do. So publications serve as a way of getting something out there that can interface with PyPI and that can interface with the Docker CLI. At least PyPI wise, like we currently for Pulp 3 we publish the simple API. So like you can just point pip straight to that and you can just do like pip install I forgot the exact command, like -- Austin, do you remember it?
I think it's -I, but the easier way to do it is, and this is the reason I don't remember the command, is just to add the URL in your pipconf.
So, like, pip can definitely interface with Pulp 3 even right now. Docker is a little bit more complicated because, like, it does require some live sync serving it. For Pulp 2, we have this project called Crane, which kind of acts as a Docker registry. So that's how we're able to do it in Pulp 2. For Pulp 3, we would probably have something similar.
Although we're not restricted to that. Pulp 3 allows plugins to register endpoints at any endpoint at all. And so it really opens the door for implementing an entire live API and doing whatever your plugin needs. On the Python side of things, we were considering using this live API to accept uploads from Twine, for instance.
And as far as the milestone for a final release of Pulp 3, what are some of the major pieces of work that you have left along that path? And do you have any sort of expected timeline of when you hope to reach that point?
So Pulp Core is probably going to be in RC this fall, so September, October-ish. There's a couple of pieces of work left for that, and that's we need to get our Ansible installer done. We need to get our CLI squared away, and we have a little bit more like minor REST API plugin API changes left to do. But also, like, we know what to do, like the scope is clear. But once core is in RC, we start like really diving into plugins. And if during the course of any plugin development we find that there's some architectural issues with core, we'll have to, account for that. But we don't really know until we start diving into plugin development. Hopefully next year, at some point, we'll go like GA with everything.
One of the things that we'd like to do is have a really long RC process because we take semantic versioning very seriously and we want to leave a lot of room to make sure that we get everything right.
And do you feel that the current implementation is at a state where early adopters can start installing and working with the system to help you find some of those sharp edges and polish some of the cases where you need to add improvements or possibly bug fixes or various things like that?
Yeah, definitely. We're at a point now where it's very clean. It's not changing very fast. We tend to get a little worked up over small changes sometimes, but that's because we're all taking it very seriously. Go ahead, Bihan.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we definitely are. We've had like a couple of plugin development workshops for Pulp 3 just to like have other people test our plugin API, and those have been really successful. Someone wrote the initial start of like a Maven plugin, so that's really cool. But it's definitely ready for testing and for like all kinds of feedback. And like if you want like to have your feedback considered and like act upon really, really quickly, now is the time. If you ever want to use Pulp, try it now, see if there's anything missing. If there is, let us know and we'll like get it in.
I would actually say that the Python plugin is past where it was for Pulp 2.
Oh yeah.
So the Python plugin for Pulp 3 is very feature rich and will be useful already.
Yeah, we kind of like stayed up all of PyCon working on that.
What have you found to be some of the most interesting or challenging or unexpected aspects of building and maintaining the Pulp project?
So a project like Pulp is inherently difficult because, well, first of all, content management is a complicated problem, and it always is, and it always doesn't seem like it should be, but it always is. And you can look at the history of Python packaging, and you can look at the history of RPMs, and it's always messy, and that's by necessity because it's a messy domain. But one of the problems that we run into frequently in Pulp is that we are trying to work on something that can work for all of these different answers to the same difficult, complex questions. And so we often see Pulp through the lens of the plugins that we spend the most time with. For me, I always see it through the Python lens, but others on the team may see it through the RPM lens or the Docker lens. And we tend to want to pull it in different directions because of that. But in the end, we're usually pretty well able to come to a good consensus about what the best thing to do across the board.
And one thing that I think is worth doing a bit more of a deep dive on is you mentioned briefly the idea of versioning the repository and being able to roll back and roll forward based on as you publish new releases or new sets of packages to make it easier to maybe move forward or backward in time to reproduce various states of a system. So can you talk a bit more about how that works and some of the use cases that it enables?
So one of the main use cases is just rollback, right? A sysadmin publishes a piece of content, a user finds out it doesn't work, and they need to go back. So with Pulp, because the publications are stored, publications are also versioned. But because the repos and publications are versioned, they could just roll back pretty much instantaneously to the previous version.
That's also what enables the reproducibility use case to work. Once you create a publication, you know exactly what's in that repository can't ever change.
Can't ever change is a little bit strong. If you published a password in a publication just by accident, there are ways you can change it, but it's fairly difficult.
Well, you can delete the publication, but the publication itself will never change on you, and so you can rely on it. Another thing we should probably mention is that versioned repositories is one of the big draws for Pulp 3. It's a completely new feature in Pulp 3, and we've built everything around it, and I think it really will make the whole thing much easier to go through your workflows.
And I think that it's definitely one of the more appealing features, and it would also help with being able to do staged releases of dependencies. So you're able to point your QA system, for instance, at the newest version and your production instances at the prior version, and be able to determine with a fair amount of certainty that even if you need to redeploy your production system before you are done with your QA testing, you're not going to accidentally pick up new versions of packages.
Exactly. And also worth noting is that because we create these objects called publications, enabling them or disabling them at a particular place is a synchronous action. So in a single REST call that can't be interrupted, it will automatically forward your request to the old publication if you roll back. And so you don't need to worry about a moment of downtime while you're republishing or anything like that, because we're using the same publication in both places.
Yeah, it definitely makes the software development lifecycle a lot easier. I know that Python in particular doesn't exactly support anything like that, like PyPI in general. So, there's test PyPI, but there's really no way to promote from test PyPI to PyPI. But with Pulp, you could roll through those stages, like you said.
And what are some of the future plans that you have for Pulp as you move to the version 3 release and then beyond that?
So one of the features that we haven't talked about, which is not technically a part of Pulp Core, but it is part of the Pulp project, is what we call lazy sync. We'll definitely be getting that going at or before the GA. And what that is it's a deferred download system. So for PyPI, for instance, you could sync all of the metadata from PyPI, but not download the bits until they're requested from a user. And the reason for that's obvious. You save a lot of disk space, you save a lot of bandwidth, and you can still sync the whole thing.
And in that case, it's used as more of a read-through cache without having to reach out all the way to PyPI to determine whether or not a package exists. But then if you actually do want to install it, you wait until that point to actually pull the package so that you, as you said, can lazily evaluate it and only store the packages that you're actually using.
Exactly. And so we also have a streamer that's a part of this. So pip doesn't need to know anything about this. Pip will retrieve the bits from Pulp and have no idea that it came from somewhere from like PyPI.
Yeah, it's worth noting that that's already a feature in Pulp 2. We're going to be bringing it to Pulp 3.
And that'll be available for all of the plugins. For Pulp 2, it's only available for Pulp RPM.
Yeah, that's true. And for Pulp Python in particular, I really want users to be able to twine upload to Pulp, and then I want users to be able to Pulp export to PyPI. So like once they've gone through like the testing lifecycle, the UAT lifecycle, like all that stuff, like they should be able to push it to production in PyPI. So I definitely want that.
One of my personal goals is to make Pulp really, really easy to use and really, really easy to develop, and especially to develop new plugins. And so I think we've got very good documentation today, but I expect it to continue to improve and just become more and more user-friendly, because we know that the best way to build a community is to have good docs.
And are there any particular areas of contribution that would be most helpful from the community as you continue to build and develop the version 3 release?
Well, the easiest way to get started is just to be a Pulp user, and that's a huge thing for us. If you're using Pulp and filing bugs, asking questions, or helping anyone else on Freenode or on the mailing lists, these things are all very valuable contributions. And if you find something that doesn't fit your needs, that's even more valuable. We'd love for community members to add features. We're always accepting pull requests. We actually kind of go out of our way to accept pull requests from the community. Sometimes someone will implement a feature that we didn't really quite want, but since they did it and they need it, why not? So we take a lot of pull requests from the community. We also really want to encourage plugin development. And so if there is a content type that Pulp doesn't cover, I think it's actually very simple to write a plugin, and I think we've got very good docs to support that.
And are there any other aspects of the project or anything related that we didn't cover yet that we should discuss before we start to close out the show?
I do want to say something about why I see Pulp is kind of amazing, and like why it's just really great. And this is paraphrased from one of my coworkers who's very, very eloquent. So software is becoming more and more complicated, right? There's more dependencies. There's more dependencies from a lot of places. And these dependencies are always changing. And what people need is, so there is definitely a need for a repository manager. And that need is currently being fulfilled by either closed source software or software that only does one content type. And our goal in the long run is for everyone to have access to free and open services that's necessary for the creation of software.
Great. Well, for anybody who wants to get in touch with either of you and follow the work that you're doing with Pulp, I'll have you each add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And with that, I'll move us into the picks. And this week, I'm going to choose the book Soonish, which is a very humorous and informative look at some of the various areas of science that are seeing a lot of exciting developments that may or may not end up panning out to produce very valuable results for us. It's written by a comic artist and his wife, who is the scientist, and they interviewed a lot of the people who are doing this research. So there are a lot of humorous comics interspersed throughout, and it's a very enjoyable read. So I definitely recommend that. And so with that, I'll pass it to you, Austin. Do you have any picks this week?
I do, but before I tell you about it, I have to tell you that I'm wearing a science t-shirt that I got from a Kickstarter from the same author as Soonish. So for my pick, I've chosen the Shostakovich String Quartet No. 8. Emerson Quartet has a very nice recording of that. It's classical music, but not the kind of classical music that you might fall asleep to.
All right. And Bihan, do you have any picks this week?
I have a YouTube channel that I'm watching a lot of. So the AOPA, the Aircraft Owner Pilot something, They have a YouTube channel called Air Safety Institute, and on it they have a bunch of accident case studies. So I'm going to solo for my private pilot license this Sunday, weather permitting, and I literally cannot stop watching people get into accidents on airplanes. But it's a really good series, and like they analyze the cause and effects and like what people did wrong very, very well.
All right. Well, thank you both for taking the time out of your day to join me and discuss the work that you're doing with Pulp. It's definitely a very interesting project and one that I am planning on using for my own infrastructure and most likely developing some plugins for. So I appreciate the work you're doing on that. I'm excited to see how the version 3 progresses, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks.